Hello, Indy Reformed. This is the video for week 5, day 2. Yesterday we saw the Noahic covenant, the covenant made with Noah in Genesis. Today we are looking at another covenant made with a prominent figure in Genesis, the Abrahamic covenant. So there are 3 main passages that we look at to see God making the covenant with Abraham: Genesis 12, 15, and 17. And we'll focus mainly on Genesis 15 today. But as we're reading Genesis, when we come to Abraham, we come to really the central figure in the book of Genesis, and one of the central figures in all of redemptive history. He's important for everything that comes later. God promises to him that he will have an offspring, even though he is childless. He will have a son as an heir, and not only one descendant, but his descendants will become so large, so many, that they will be like the sand of the seashore or the stars of heavens. They would be uncountable. And so we see in Genesis 15 that God promises these things to still childless Abraham, and he also promises him that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, the promised land. And so Abraham asks, or Abram as he's known then, asks, how can he know these things since he is still childless? He has no descendants. And God tells him to do something that seems strange to us as modern day Americans. He tells him to go get 5 animals: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. And so Abraham does this. He gets these 5 animals, and he kills them all. He takes the 3 largest and cuts them in half and lays them side by side. And we see that the birds come down to eat, and Abraham drives them away. And we can ask, what on earth is going on here? How is this going to confirm anything to Abraham? Well, this was a very common way of making a covenant in the ancient Near East. In fact, the Hebrew word for make a covenant is actually cut a covenant, referring to this idea of cutting animals in half and walking through them in order to make the covenant. It was meant to be a symbol. These animals were killed and cut in half, and if I break this covenant that I'm making, may I also be killed and cut in half. And so Abraham does this, and he waits, and he falls asleep. And in the dream, he sees these animals laying side by side, cut in half and dead. And he also sees something else. We read in Genesis 15:12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go down to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces of the animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land. So God repeats his promises to Abraham in this dream, and he makes a covenant with him. He has this torch and this pot that come as representations of God, as images of God, basically, that he gives to Abraham so that he can see. And what happens? Only God passes through the pieces. Now, normally, both members of the covenant, both Abraham and God in this case, would have walked through the pieces and said, if either of us break this, may these things happen to us. But what happens here is only God makes this covenant. Only God passes through these pieces. Only God takes the covenant curses upon himself if this fails to happen. So what he's saying is, only I will ensure that these things come to pass. This is a covenant that cannot be broken. It's not like the covenant of works. It's a covenant that's gracious. And we can know that this thing is certain because it is based on God's word, based on God's life. The penalty is death, and we know that God cannot die, and so we know this covenant will be certain. And what are some of the promises of the covenant? We don't have time to get into all of them, but part of the promise of the covenant is that the seed of the woman, promised in Genesis 3, will come through Abraham. That Christ will come through the line of Abraham because of this covenant that God is setting up with him. And because Christ comes, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So as we go forward in redemptive history, we can see that this is an administration of the covenant of grace. This is how the covenant of grace is coming into history. And we see the promises of God to Abraham, as we'll see, go beyond Abraham to us, even in the new covenant, are sure, because we cannot break this covenant. Only God is responsible for these promises, and so we know that they will come to pass. So this is the Abrahamic covenant, and we'll see you tomorrow.